Um, I am going to talk about compound flood modeling for coastal environments. And before I start, let me acknowledge the funding sources for this work. So this was funded first by the Department of Defense under the High Performance Computing Modernization Program, a program called PET. And under that program, we worked with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So I'll be talking about some work that we did under the Corps of Engineers project. And then also the National Science Foundation Pre-Events Program and the National and NOAA's Computational Technology Program. And we also want to acknowledge the NSF Exceed program and the Texas Advanced Computing Center for their high performance computing support. Also, I want to acknowledge all the people that have contributed to this work, and those include Mark Loveland, Namo, and Eric Valseth, who are current working in my group at UT Austin. Wei Lee, who was a former grad student of mine and is now at Facebook. Gajanan Chowdhury, also a former grad student and postdoc and now at Intel. Amin Kiagati, who was a former postdoc and is now at the Texas Water Development Board. Shibra Misra, who used to work at the Corps of Engineers and now is at the Water Institute of the Gulf. And then Helena Mosser and Alessandro Parola, who are in the Fort Worth district of the Army Corps of Engineers. So I'm going to be focusing on hurricanes and severe storms. And this is, if you've heard me speak before, you probably know that I've been working in this area for a long time. And of course, hurricanes disrupt lives and cause significant damage to infrastructure, environment, and so forth. Billions of dollars of damage. And in the last, decade to 20 years, we've seen really major events. And during a hurricane, of course, wind, the storm surge, and the rainfall are the primary hazards. And it's become more and more clear that, especially in recent events, that some hurricanes are rain dominated, such as Hurricane Harvey, where you had some storm surge down on the sort of mid to lower part of the Texas coast, and then 50 to 60 inches of rain in the Houston area, and then going up to Beaumont. And other storms are more surge-based events, such as Hurricane Ike, but in both cases, there was significant surge combined with rainfall. So, for example, in Hurricane Ike, and this is just an example of compound flooding, and I'll give a more precise definition in a second, we had both surge coming in from, say, Galveston Bay, and this is just focusing, in this figure, I'm focusing on a couple of measurement stations that are located in Houston. So we had surge from Galveston Bay, and we had runoff from the bayous and the streams in the Houston area. And so Ike was a strong Category 2 hurricane, happened in 2008. It generated about 5.3 meters of storm surge in Galveston Bay, and then 4.3 meters going all the way up the Houston Ship Channel into Houston, and then up to 17 inches of rain in some areas. And so if we look at this graph on the left, the blue curve is a water surface elevation gauge at Morgan's Point in Houston, and you can see the storm surge coming in and then peaking and then, leveling off. But there was also some contribution from rainfall. This is a rainfall gauge that's nearby in Greens Bayou. And you can see that right before the storm surge was at its peak, there was, a good 13, 14 inches of rain, and that continued for, about another day before the rain dissipated. So we have these combined events. And so this is according to the IPCC 2012 report. A compound flood or a compound event are two or more extreme events occurring simultaneously or successively, or a combination of extreme events with underlying conditions that amplify the impact of the events, or combinations of events that are not themselves extremes, but lead to an extreme event or impact when combined. So the contributing events can be of similar or different types. So they're just clustered. They can also happen sequentially or more or less simultaneously, as I said earlier. So what I'm going to focus on is compound flooding due to surge and floodwater coming in from a rainfall event through some watersheds. So just a diagram here. So in these types of systems, we have a coastal surge system, which is connected to the ocean. So this is our coastal environment. Then we have some kind of river or channel system that comes into the coastal surge system. And feeding into that hydraulic system is a watershed or multiple watersheds or tributaries that, of course, there might be multiple tributaries that feed into the river. So all of this contributes to the flooding, and the flooding may happen in along the coast, and it may happen as well in the inland parts where they get significant rainfall. And then there's this sort of gray zone, or this area that we've highlighted here, where both can happen at the same time, okay? So we can have the compound flooding can happen in this box. And the question is, from a modeling perspective, what do we do here? Because if we look at what's happened historically, so the coastal ocean modeling community has been on, in one camp, and the rainfall modeling community has been in another, and we did not really interact that much until just in the last few years. So the codes, the models, the infrastructure, the uses of these codes has been done in different disciplines and different camps. And now we need to combine them in a way that makes sense. Okay, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on going through all the mathematical equations. Either you are familiar with shallow water equations or you aren't. And if you're not, I would suggest that you look at Wikipedia, because Wikipedia has a pretty good summary of all the different models. But there are a number of different shallow water models, and we use them in different environments depending on what's appropriate for that environment. But I'm only going to focus here on 1D and 2D models. There are 3D shallow water models, but I'm not going to be focused on that today. I'm just going to focus on 1D and 2D. So the starting point of all the shallow water models is the Navier-Stokes equations, 3D Navier-Stokes equations. And to obtain the 2D shallow water models, we assume that the vertical momentum is negligible. So the change in the vertical over the water column is negligible, and we can average the Navier-Stokes equations over the water depth. So these are the 2D, the horizontal momentum equations in the X and Y directions, and the continuity equation. And that gives rise to the 2D shallow water equations. So the 2D shallow water equations include continuity and momentum equations, and the momentum equations includes inertial terms, so pressure, time derivative and an advective term, pressure gradient, bathymetric gradients, bottom friction or bottom drag, and top surface forcing that comes from wind and atmospheric pressure and perhaps some other terms. Now, if you're in a channel, a very narrow channel, the cross-directional flow, the tangential flow, may be negligible. And so you can do another averaging over the cross-section and come up with the 1D St. Venant equations. And this is two equations that account for the water flux going down the channel and the change in the channel cross-section. And then another model that one can come up with is the diffusive wave equation, which assumes, for example, if you're in a watershed or in a very a flat region along the coast, say, that may be heavily vegetated, you can assume that the inertial terms are small And you can balance the pressure gradient, bathymetric gradient, and the bottom friction and come up with what's called the diffusive wave equation, which turns out to be a 2D nonlinear parabolic equation for the water height. So a 2D equations, but in one variable. And then finally, an even further simplification of these models is the kinematic wave equation. This again is a 1D equation used in channels where you have fairly steep slope. And so the gradient, the slope gradient and the bottom friction are assumed to balance. And what you end up with in that case is a 1D nonlinear conservation law for water height or discharge. So different codes use different models in different parts of the domain that are appropriate for that part of the domain. Okay, so going back to my little diagram here, in the watershed and often in the river system, we may use the kinematic wave equation or the diffusive wave equation. We might just use the shallow water equations directly, or we might use the St. Bernard equations. In the coastal surge system, we almost always use the full 2D shallow water equations. So if we're going to model this entire system, we have to essentially couple these different models together. And I should also say that these models operate at very different time scales, or they can operate at very different time scales and very different spatial scales. All right, so some of the models that I'm going to talk about today or refer to are a model that I have been involved in developing called ADCIRC, Advanced Circulation Model. This model's been around for over 30 years, many contributors to it. I'll not give any details about it, but you can certainly, again, look up Google ADCIRC and all kinds of papers will come up. Another model that I'm going to mention is based on another formulation. So ADCIRC is based on a continuous finite element Galerkin finite element formulation. We've also looked at discontinuous Galerkin models. And so another code that I'm going to refer to is called DG-SWIM, which was primarily developed at UT Austin, at Notre Dame, and at Ohio State, with some other contributors as well. So those are the two coastal ocean models that I will refer to. They solve the 2D shallow water equations. In terms of rainfall runoff models, again, these have been developed by another community. And so there's some fairly standard community codes that are out there. So some of the models that I'm going to refer to are HECRAS, which was developed by the Army Corps of Engineers, Geisha, which was also developed by the Corps by a different group in the Corps of Engineers. I'm going to say a little bit about some recent work that we've done on machine learning for watershed modeling. And then finally, I'll mention some recent work on extending DG-SWIM to shallow water to watershed modeling in a code called DG-SOCI, which was developed at Ohio State by Ethan Kabotko's group. Okay, so just the remainder of the talk, I'm going to talk about different projects that we've done over. So this is some work that we've done over the last 5 years. So I'm talking about, we started out with baby steps, and we make progress, a little bit of progress every year. So the first project that we looked at was this project funded by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they use HECRAS a lot as their river model, and then they use ADCIRC and other Army Corps of Engineered models for shallow water systems. So I'm going to talk about an application where we combined HECRAS, or we looked at HECRAS inflow into ADCIRC, and this was just a one-way coupling. And the question for us really was, where do we do the coupling? Where do we provide the inflow? And we also looked at some comparisons between HECRAS and ADCIRC, and all this is going to be for Hurricane Harvey. I'll get to this in just a second. And then I'm going to talk about briefly about some water coupling software that we developed, which is our first attempt at doing a full two-way coupling between coastal ocean models and rainfall codes. And we did some work there. I'll talk about the machine learning and the coupling of that with ADCIRC, and then I'll close with some current research on model development. Okay, so in this Army Corps of Engineers project, we were specifically focused on interaction between storm surge and river discharge. So river discharge was added to ADCIRC via internal flux boundary conditions, which ADCIRC has the capability to handle inflow boundary conditions from rivers. We also evaluated ADCIRC's ability to model river discharge and overland flow by comparing to a 2D version of HECRAS on a single watershed. And then we looked at just sort of a compound flooding event using a full domain run of ADCIRC with river discharge and looking at the impacts of multiple watersheds. And we wrote a paper on this, which is available in Frontiers in Climate. And if anyone's interested, I'll be happy to share this link. Okay, so just to give some context. So Hurricane Harvey was an event which happened in 2017. It started out as what looked like a relatively minor hurricane. It formed off the coast of Mexico. It formed and then it rapidly intensified. I do remember it formed on a Wednesday, and by Friday, it was a Category 4 hurricane, and it was making landfall just north of Corpus Christi. And so due to a high pressure system over the upper parts of Texas at that time, it meandered about, and it actually went along the coast, and it went back out into the ocean. This black line here is the track. It kind of turned around, went back out into the coast, into the Gulf, and then ended up making a second landfall just at the Louisiana-Texas border. So I'm going to show you a simulation done using ADCIRC, and the vectors here are the wind fields, and the colors in a second will be the water surface elevation. Oh no, this is just wind, I'm sorry. Yeah, so this is just a little bit of, you can see the wind file. Okay, but that just shows the track of the hurricane. And so there was a lot of storm surge down in this region and a lot of rainfall up in this region. So as it was meandering up the coast, it dumped 50 or 60 inches of rain on Houston and up through the upper Texas coast. Okay, so one of the regions that got the most rainfall was near Beaumont, Texas. So that's in this little red box here on this map of Texas. And one of the watersheds that really got flooded was the Neches River watershed. And so the Army Corps of Engineers had built a simulation of this watershed over just this small domain. And they had this inflow here was provided by doing a full simulation of the entire Neches River, which continues beyond this barrier. There's like a barrier here that they have to release water from. It's called the saltwater barrier. And so this entire floodplain is very flat, very low. And so they developed a diffusive wave approximation of the shallow water equations, and they implemented it in this code called HECRAS. Okay, so there's also some gauges here. These red dots are gauges where they had measurements. And so I'll show some of the results at some of these measurement stations. We were also curious because, as you can see, they do not include any of the coastal region. This watershed is connected to a lake, which is then connected to the Gulf. Okay, and they didn't include any of that region in the HECRAS domain because HECRAS essentially runs on Windows machines. So we also created an ADCIRC domain that coincides with this region, and we compared the two codes. We used a NOAA gauge at the downstream area to provide downstream boundary conditions for both models. Okay, so again, this is the Neches River watershed. This is our, what the actual bathymetry looks like in this region. On the left is the ADCIRC finite element mesh that we used with the variable resolution in the channels and over the floodplain. And, excuse me, on the right here is the HECRAS domain, which uses a structured mesh, so rectangular elements. And I will say that HECRAS is a calibrated model, and what that means is they adjust certain parameters like bottom friction to try to do the best job that they can in matching the data, the measured data. So HECRAS has been tuned, whereas ADCIRC hasn't been tuned, okay? So if you look on the right here, I'm comparing the gauge measurements, the observed values, and that's these black dots. And you can see that some of the gauges were out of commission. We don't have measurements at every time, and some of them are very noisy. But HECRAS actually does a very good job of matching the data. Again, it was calibrated. The ADCIRC model, which is uncalibrated, matches pretty well, except at this one location here, which is pretty low by about a meter. So obviously there are some issues with, parameters, or, we're solving different mathematical equations, but this just shows sort of a proof of concept that both models properly calibrated can be used in this region. But this is just truth in advertising that they do get different answers. Now we wanted to look at the impact of the watersheds and what would happen, because normally in an ADCIRC simulation, we don't include the rainfall because we don't have real-time rainfall measurements. So we only look at the storm surge. So we ran Harvey simulations with as many effects as we could, tides, inflow from the Neches River and also from the Sabine River. The Sabine River is just to the right of the Neches River. It's kind of up in the upper right corner of this box here. So two major watersheds. So our forcing is tides, inflow from the Neches, Sabine, and wind forcing. Then we just looked at what happens if we only have tides, winds, and the inflow from the Neches River. Then we cut out the rivers entirely, and then we looked at just what happens if we only have tides. So how much are each of these contributors combined contributing to the flooding? Okay, so what we see is if we look at these two plots on the right, we have, if we look at what happened at the mouth of the Gulf, this is A, this is where the Gulf flows into Lake Sabine, then the flow is primarily wind driven or surge driven. So the gray here is tides only. So initially it's tides, then you see the impacts of the surge here. The surge only got up to about 0.9 meters. Okay, and then you have the water going in, the water coming out, and then basically the tides again. Whereas in the Sabine Lake, you had primarily the flooding was caused by the discharge coming from the rivers, okay? So if you just looked at tidal flow, you don't catch any of this peak here. If we only looked at surge, but no river inflow, again, we miss this peak. And if we look at wind with river inflow, then we can see how this peak is dominant. And if we turn off the wind, then you can see that at this point, all of this flooding here is due to river discharge. So it is very important that we consider both events here to get proper solutions. Okay, so I just want to focus here on this lower right figure. So if we look at all of the effects, so we model the entire region, the entire Gulf, all of the watersheds in this region, the Neches, Sabine, the floodplains, et cetera. We include the river inflow, the surge, et cetera. Then we see this water surface elevation profile in the lower right corner here. And so, as you can see, there was significant flooding coming from both the Sabine River and the Neches River, and that water was actually directed towards these marshlands that are to the east. And this is actually what was observed. There was not a lot of flooding due to storm surge along the coast. However, one could assume or maybe guess that storm surge prevented some of this water from flowing out of the Gulf, and instead it flowed in this direction. Okay, so that's one of the consequences of compound flooding. Okay, so conclusions for this part of the talk. Accounting for these watersheds has significant impact on the accuracy of the water surface elevations. We did neglect like other physical effects such as short range waves and pluvial flooding and the actual rainfall. So that could be in general why some of the water surface elevations were a little bit under predicted. Okay, so moving on to the next topic. So after this project ended, we started looking at how can we couple these codes more effectively rather than just running them in sort of one-way coupled mode. So Gajanan Chowdhury, who was my student at the time, developed some software using Python where he can couple different CFD models. And it has the capability to do both one-way and two-way coupling. And the data exchange is in memory. So we're not doing file exchanges. And it actually turns out that Python gives the flexibility to do this. And you can even couple, it's a little bit more work, but you can couple Fortran and C or C++ together. So we have an open source code that is available. It does require having Python interfaces, and but that requires a little bit of work. But there is an infrastructure for this. So if you're interested, I can share this with you. It's hosted on GitHub, and we've actually demonstrated coupling between several models. I'm just going to focus here on the coupling between ADCIRC and another rainfall runoff model called Geisha, and ADCIRC and this machine learning algorithm, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So the coupling is fairly straightforward. We have a time loop. We solve, say, the coastal surge model. We use that to update boundary conditions in memory for the second model, which may be the rainfall model. We solve the rainfall model. We use that to provide new inflows, say, to the surge model. And then we just time step through to final time. So one application here, this is looking again at Hurricane Harvey, but now in the Houston area. So in the Houston area, you have some major river components, the San Jacinto River here, and you have Buffalo Bayou, which flows into the Houston Ship Channel, and there's several tributaries that feed into Buffalo Bayou, including the Brays Bayou and some others. And then you have storm surge coming in through Galveston Bay. And so this is another example of compound flooding. So we did several simulations of where we looked at only doing rainfall, and then looking at coupling through this water coupler. We had observed rainfall data that we could include in the model. And so what I'm going to show you is a result in just a minute, but we ran the rainfall runoff model over this entire watershed region. And then we actually coupled this code geisha to ADCIRC at this outlet here. So think about, we have downstream boundary conditions. We have rainfall happening over this region. The water flows down this watershed. It all gathers together. Then there's a water flux that gets fed into ADCIRC, okay, right at this point. And then ADCIRC handles the rest of it out into the Gulf of Mexico. Okay, so let me focus on this slide. So there was an observation, there was a USGS gauge, and we had some gauge data where we could compare these different formulations. So the gauge data are these green dots. And if you look at just running geisha only, it actually over-predicted the flood fairly substantially in one case, depending on what kind of boundary conditions we used. So this wasn't calibrated, it was just run straight out of the box. And it also had a few oscillations that may be numerical errors. But if we coupled geisha to ADCIRC through this coupling software and we provided the proper downstream boundary conditions, then we got good matches with the data. And so this was encouraging that, you know, these kinds of couple models can actually work quite well together. Okay, so after we did this work, then my student Wei Li started looking at machine learning for predicting watersheds. And it turns out that there's been actually quite a bit of work done in the hydrology community on using machine learning in watersheds. And so we looked at Brays Bayou as an example, and Brays Bayou is a good test bed for machine learning because it's fairly well, it's a well-gauged watershed. There's lots of measurement stations, and so there's lots of data. So we used a deep recurrent neural network. In particular, we looked at long short-term memory networks. I won't get into the details of all the layers and the units and all of the et cetera, but what enters the network is precipitation, and primarily precipitation and other hydraulic input. And then the river discharge at the downstream end is predicted by the network. That's what comes out, what we're trying to predict. And the memory of the flood, of various flood events. So we feed fairly high number of flood events into the system, and it's preserved in what are called the hidden states of the network. So Wei Li actually came up with a more efficient LSTM algorithm, which he called a synced sequence to sequence method. And that's described in this paper here, which appeared in Neural Computing and Applications. And it turned out that this was a variation on the long short-term memory algorithm. And it turned out to be more efficient in both time and memory complexity. So just to show an example for Brays Bayou, these are the rainfall gauges. You can see how many rainfall gauges there are. This is where the USGS gauge is located. So this is what we're trying to look at. So we collected precipitation and river discharge data from 2007 to 2017. Then we trained the model on data from 2007 to 2015. We used the 2016 data to validate the model. And then we compared it to data from 2017, which is 2017 is when Hurricane Harvey. And again, the discharge at this green dot is what we're trying to predict using the LSTM network. Okay, so this shows some comparison between what was observed at the gauge for different types of rainfall events. A low rainfall event where all of them did pretty well, the observation compared to a memory intensive LSTM compared to a more reduced memory LSTM compared to a physics-based model, Geisha. So for a low rainfall event, all of them did fairly well. For a moderate rainfall event, then we start to see some discrepancies between, especially with Geisha, the machine learning is still doing pretty well. For a high rainfall event, Geisha tends to overpredict like it did before, and the machine learning algorithms both did pretty well. And then again, looking at Hurricane Harvey, with Geisha, we had these oscillations, and both machine learning algorithms or implementations got the initial peak, but the full model really did a better job of almost capturing the entire flood event, which was pretty surprising to us, because a storm of the magnitude of Harvey really was kind of outside of the test bed, outside of the training set. So this on the right here, you can see some of the errors that were computed for this reduced model. Okay, and then we use this water coupling software to couple this LSTM runoff model with ADCIRC. So this is actually being done in sort of a two-way couple mode. So the neural network is running more or less in real time. And then we're using downstream boundary conditions from ADCIRC to feed back into the neural network, and we're updating the neural network. Again, looking at the input into the RNN, which is precipitation from gauges, and then the water level at Morgan's Point. That's what we're using for the data, which we can get from ADCIRC. And then the output is the water discharge at the watershed outlet. And for ADCIRC, the input is the flux boundary condition coming from the neural network, coming from the machine learning algorithm. And the output is the elevation field and the velocity field, including the water surface elevation, which is then fed back into the neural network. So this shows that if we compare to, again, a gauge record, if we do this full coupling, then we get good matches with the gauge record. If we just use the neural network by itself, then again, we kind of underpredict. So adding this additional data coming from ADCIRC, or coming even from if we have a NOAA gauge, if we use that, then we get almost exact match with the observation. Okay, so I'm going to conclude here with just some words on what we're doing now. So everything that I talked about was, sort of historical runs, 2017 and, earlier. And of course, this is 2022, and the coast continues to evolve. So we are rebuilding our models for both Texas and Louisiana to include more resolution in the watersheds and in the river channels. And one reason for doing that is so that we can continue to look at these two-way couplings between codes like HECRAS and ADCIRC, or this discontinuous Galerkin code that I mentioned earlier in ADCIRC. Another thing that we're adding to the model is actually having rainfall on the mesh, which we hadn't done before. So everything I showed you before neglected the rainfall that's actually falling on the mesh. So this new mesh, there's two versions of it. This is what we call the 120 meter mesh, which has a minimum resolution of 120 meters in these coastal inlets. It's being developed primarily at University of Notre Dame by Johannes Westering's group. And it has better resolution in the rivers and the watersheds. So for example, in Houston, if you look at Clear Creek, if you look at Buffalo Bayou, the San Jacinto River, the Trinity River, again, the Neches River, we have much better resolution than we ever had before in these rivers. So finally, going back to Hurricane Harvey, revisiting this test case of the Neches River, we've now introduced rainfall on the mesh. We still have the water coming down down the river from upstream. And if we include all these effects together, and this simulation was run using our discontinuous Galerkin code, then you can see how there's ponding due to the rainfall. There's water, this massive flood coming from above, which is the water coming down the channel. And so this includes almost all of the physical effects that we would want to include in a rainfall event. What we haven't done here is actually coupled it to the downstream boundary. So that's what we're trying to do at the moment. So with that, I think that's my last slide. Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the audience? You can post them in Q&A or here in chat, and I will unmute you. You can also ask the question in person, so you can also just raise your hand. And while we're waiting for that, I have one question that is related to, there seems to be always a difference in answers that different numerical methods provide. That's not surprising. Are they different enough to matter in some sort of decision making or policy making? If I need to decide to evacuate, does it really matter?
Yeah, I would say that if you talk to emergency managers, they would like to have accuracy within, they would really like to have accuracy within, say, 0.5 meter at most of their decision points. And so if you're off by more than that, and so there are some codes that are used for prediction that have been historically used, say by the National Hurricane Center, and they tend to overpredict because they wanted to be super cautious, in their predictions. They didn't want to underpredict because they were afraid that if they did that, then, people that needed to evacuate perhaps wouldn't evacuate. But what that does is that causes unneeded or unnecessary evacuations, which can be just as dangerous as not evacuating. And so like during Harvey, I work with we provide output to the State Operations Center in real time, and they were looking at our results, and they were comparing it to some results from the Hurricane Center. And the results from the Hurricane Center showed that Corpus Christi was going to flood, more or less, and so they were going to basically have to evacuate Corpus Christi. And our results showed that Corpus Christi was not going to flood. And so they had to make a decision, and they decided not to evacuate Corpus Christi, and that turned out to be the right decision. But evacuating a city the size of Corpus Christi is a major,
that's about
undertaking, about 300,000 people. And that, they mostly have to worry about people in nursing homes, hospitals. And so you can actually, you evacuate somebody out of a nursing home, and you can, they
major, help. It's a health concern.
Right. It's a serious thing. So, yeah.
Chris, you have a question?
Hey, thanks so much, Clint. There's so many interesting comparisons you have in here. So the follow up, I guess, on that discussion that y'all just had is because when you're doing engineering, I think sometimes, or at least I'm learning as I'm teaching undergraduate engineers about hydrology, that being conservative is not necessarily sort of the ethical or moral choice. What your goal is accurate, because when you're conservative, overly conservative, you cost your clients money, and in some cases, it is a safety risk. Like if you evacuate a huge city because you said, well, I don't want to try to be more careful with my models, I'm just going to say, yeah, it's going to flood, and then people die evacuating. So this seems to really arise in like one of the things that seems to be really driving the uncertainty here, or the modeling questions, is the overland flow watershed piece.
Yeah, right.
That seems to be implicit in your use of machine learning. So it's almost like I feel like we still have a big open question there about whether deterministic mechanistic modeling is as good as semi-empirical approaches. And in your case, you're using a more state-of-the-art approach, which is machine learning, instead of some of the old-fashioned watershed, overland flow estimates that are based on, semi-empirical parameter estimations. I just wondered if from your experience now, you can comment on whether you see, is there a route to a mechanistic understanding of the terrestrial flooding that we need to keep doing, or is it really something where you think machine learning is really the only approach, because we'll never be able to get the variability and the physics right in the water?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because they're spending millions of dollars developing the national water model, which is a mechanistic, deterministic, is a physics-based model, and trying to use it in real-time predictions. And of course, one of the problems in real time is that we don't have accurate enough precipitation data yet. And that just really comes from the fact that the resolution of the meteorological components are not quite there yet. So you really, if you have Doppler radar, you can do much better, but you don't have Doppler radar necessarily over the entire coast. You might have it over a city or over certain regions. And then if you're feeding that into a expensive mechanistic model, do you have time to do the simulation before you actually have to make a decision? And so I'm not gonna go out on the limb that machine learning is going to solve all our problems, because I'm not sure that I believe that yet, but I do think it's definitely worth having in your tool bag. And I think the jury's still out on that question. But as the mechanistic models, if we could show that if we had the proper precipitation data, they can do spot on predictions, and they can do them fast, then I would still say you'd want to have that in your back pocket. You would always want to have that in your back pocket. I don't know if I hope I'm weaving and bobbing enough to not answer your question. But I'm trying not to. I've said I definitely don't want to say that machine learning is going to solve all our problems, but I do think that it has shown some really interesting promise that I wasn't expecting, to be honest with you. But it's still, it costs money to train it, right? So, it's not a free lunch.
I think one of the comparisons I thought would be interesting that you may have, and I know you need to go to your next questioner, was, your very first comparison was between a highly calibrated deterministic model and ADCIRC, and there you showed obviously the calibrated model wins out, but it would be interesting to see the machine learning model calibrated against data set, see what the difference in performance is. But anyway, I'll be quiet now.
No, you're right, because you can't do the calibration until after the event's over.
Right.
So, that's not really fair. So, if you're trying to do real time, it's not really fair. Now you could say, well, for future events, but they sort of have to calibrate it for every event. That's kind of what they do.
Gautam, I hope I'm saying that your name right. You're unmuted, so you can ask your question, or I can read it out.
So I was wondering whether when you were coupling two-way between the models, since the models are using different physics, at the coupling point, were you seeing numerical shocks, or were the challenges that you had to ensure the solution is accurate enough? Or
that's a good question. So what we did was we kind of overlapped the models in a way. So the coupling, there was probably a little bit of I might have misled you a little bit. So the ADCIRC model went up the channel a little bit further, and the Geisha model went down the channel. So there was actually an area of overlap. And then we were using so what Geisha will accept as a boundary condition is a downstream water level. And you can either get that from a gauge or you can get it from a model. And they often just get it from a gauge. They look for where a gauge is, and that's where they put their downstream boundary condition. So it might be a tide gauge or whatever. So that's what you feed back into the code, like Geisha or HECRAS. And then what ADCIRC needs is a water flux. What Geisha and HECRAS computes is a discharge, but you can convert that to a flux. There's a formula that will give you the flux. And so they're solving slightly different equations, but you can get the quantities that you need out of both of them. And then to avoid kind of this numerical discrepancies, we didn't quite just couple them at a strict interface. We overlapped the two domains. I can send you some more. I mean, that's not a very good explanation, but I can send you some further reports and stuff that we wrote that explain it better.
Sounds great. Thanks.
Okay.
Yerlan, would you like to ask your question in person?
Yes, thank you. Hi again. It's a great
Hi,
presentation.
it's good to see you. How are you?
I'm doing
Yeah,
well. Good.
good.
So thank you for your presentation. So just wondering about in the flow rate prediction with the machine learning algorithms, how much computational time requires for the training model? Because it looks like qualitatively they had a good kind of capturing the pattern. I mean, of course, it's in terms of accuracy might require some additional physical model, as you mentioned. It's AD advanced model. Let me put that way. So the question is, like, is it maybe faster in terms of getting certain?
So once you train it, to use it for predictions just takes a few seconds. The training takes some number of hours depending on how many hidden layers and all the choices that you make in the machine learning algorithm. The training might take a couple of hours, or it might take 10 hours. But that's just once you have the training, you don't have to do that over again, right? So then you can just start using it for predictions. The predictions can be done in a few seconds. So, compared to an ADCIRC model, which takes, say, a full ADCIRC run takes on a supercomputer takes, 15 to 30 minutes to do roughly the same calculation. Now, remember, we're getting one quantity out of the machine learning algorithm. We're getting one number. We're just getting a discharge. So it's just like, I need to know the water elevation at this point or whatever. And the machine learning algorithm is going to produce that one number, whereas ADCIRC is giving you the full solution. So, that's one of the differences is you have to ask, what are you trying to get out of the calculation, right? And so if you're just interested in, is it going to flood at this location? You can get that in seconds using a machine learning algorithm. But, if you need to know, is it going to flood in this entire city? That would take a lot longer to do in a machine learning setting. Okay. Does that make sense? So you'd have to train a bunch of machine learning algorithms on data to do that.
Thank you. Yeah.
So if I can just, to wrap up, ask one more question that is related to that. So are most of the gauges online?
Yes.
So technically, with the machine learning model, a citizen scientist could potentially engage.
All of that data is publicly available. Yes.
Is there an effort to do that or try to? Because that could also further calibrate, possibly overfit the model, but.
I mean, citizen scientists are definitely, becoming part of the the discussion as far as, at least hopefully the ones that understand, hopefully the science part.
Right.
People that have an axe to grind, or people that are looking for a reason to sue the Corps of Engineers or something. But yeah, if you had it, like, yeah, you could do this. You could just run a black box machine learning algorithm. You can collect the data yourself. I mean, you can download a machine algorithm from anywhere. I mean, you know, you can have it running on your laptop. You can download the data, train it. Sure.
So
Yeah.
that's potentially, because parallel computing is a little harder way to engage.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, not everybody has access to
Right.
Stampede or Frontera. That's true.